Hi, my name's Chris. Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to talk about everything I would change about my layout after using it for the past 5 years. Stick around. Okay, so in my last video, I talked about kind of the design concept and my imperatives whenever I set out to design this layout to fit my workshop into a one-car garage bay. If you want to see that video, I'll put a link below, or there's a link up here you can click. Okay, so before we get into some of the details of what I would change, up front, I am very happy with the arrangement and orientation of all the tools. What I talked about in the last video is that I actually spent about 2 years planning this layout before I was able to build it. At the time I was living in Alaska, and I just didn't think it was smart to build this setup when I was getting ready to have to move it down to the lower 48 states. So I put that off for about 2 years while I designed it and kind of tweaked the arrangement, looked at the interferences between the machines, etc. And then ultimately in 2015, I built this setup as it is now over a period of about a year, and continued to refine it and add to it over the time since then. But ultimately, I would not change the orientation of the tools. I wouldn't change the fact that I've got dust collection hooked up to everything, and everything's plugged in and wired and on a shared 20 amp circuit. For my benchtop tools, that's adequate power for now. There's a few things in the future like dust collection improvements that if I change, that would not be appropriate. And depending on what tools I upgrade, if I start to max out my my total amperage, I would have to change the way I at least draw power. But fundamentally, I actually wouldn't change the primary parts of the setup. Okay, so up front, there's one thing I would change in material selection. So this is, I want to say this is poplar core birch veneer plywood. I think I bought it at the Home Depot. But there's a large void in it right here that goes almost the whole way across this panel. Anyhow, bottom line, material selection. When you're setting out to build something that's going to be central to your workshop, like a workbench, buy the best quality materials you could afford. At the time, I think I did that, and I don't think I had access to a cabinet supplier that sold full sheets of Baltic birch, but I could have gotten 4 5x5 sheets and build it that way. But anyhow, what I'm saying is, if I were building this again, I would go out and buy 2 4x8 sheets of 3/4 inch or 20 millimeter Baltic birch plywood. Anyhow, I don't know how many laminations are in that, but it's much more solid, much more flat, and just structurally it'd be a lot better choice for the top and bottom of this cart. And I really didn't save any money. So as an example, I think those sheets of plywood were close to $50. I bought 2 of them. At my local cabinet supplier here near Nashville, I recently just bought 48 by 96 sheets of Baltic birch for right around $50. I want to say it was $52 a sheet. And so I really didn't save any money. I sacrificed quality, and there's a lot more benefits to it in places where cut miter slots or router inserts or drill dog holes. You just keep that much more strength due to the extra laminations in that birch. And birch is relatively hard, so you get a little bit more stiffness also. So no offense to Home Depot, it's just cabinet suppliers. I promise you this, can always beat the box stores when it comes to margins on plywood, just because they deal in bulk, often wholesale type rates. So if you have a local cabinet supplier, which you likely do, go check them out and see what they stock. You'll probably be pleasantly surprised. Okay, so one of my first mistakes that I made when laying this out, I artificially kind of limited everything else I did by way of making my carts 40 inches by 96 inches long. And I cut off 8 inches of the sheet of plywood because I thought that at one point I would have to take all these machines off and pack these into crates for moving. Keep in mind, my move from Alaska to the lower 48 was a crated move. A lot of transportation. Whenever you do a contracted move, a lot of times they will build or they have prefabbed wooden crates, and they will stack all of your belongings into them. And I've done 2 moves in the past with crates. So I thought that it was likely that I would have to fit this into a crated move, which may still happen, but at least when it comes to the military, weight is your authorization, and the moving company actually has to figure out the way to move you. So I may have artificially constrained myself. That 8 inches that I removed is now 8 inches of outfeed support for the table saw. Width-wise, that I've lost, I actually had to move my table saw to the right a little bit, which made the interference with the miter saw slightly closer by several inches. I think I moved my table saw 2 inches to the right. So with my current setup, you can see I have my track saw track here. To the right of the blade, I have 21 inches of clearance, slightly over 21 inches, all the way through the end of the bench. Standard cabinet depth ranges from about 24 inches or 23.5 inches minus the facing to about 30 inches deep. My goal was to not limit what I could cut through my table saw. So you can see I did limit it a little bit, whereas if I had moved it over for the 2 inches, I'd be able to cut 23 or 24 inches through the saw. That's really not a huge constraint because of the fact that I typically break down sheet goods with a circular saw, or now I use a track saw. And I also have 64 inches of clearance between the outfeed of the table saw and the fence of the miter saw, where I can cut a full width anything or cross cut a full sheet here. So if I cross cut my material first, it always mitigates that. As far as the trade-offs of having the miter saw on its own completely separate station, I just don't have the space for it, at least in the way I've configured things. So I'm happy to move that every once in a while, or just now I just break it down with the track saw and it's a non-issue. So anyhow, that's kind of a main limitation there. I would like to make some kind of a roller guide that comes out here and just stays on plane with the table saw top, maybe in 2 locations, just to be able to support out to the middle of a sheet of plywood for running heavier cuts through the table saw. I do use roller stands when I do large panels. However, roller stands aren't very good for sheet goods because sheet goods will flex, and I'm talking for cutting by myself. Having a partner mitigates all of that. But roller stands just aren't ideal for sheet goods because a sheet good coming through the saw, if it's unsupported, is going to dip down or flex and can catch that roller stand. Whereas if you have continuous support, obviously the flex is a non-issue then. In my plans, I made the cart 48 by 96 inches because I just don't want other people to have to deal with that. Okay, so there's definitely some things I want to change about my joiner mount, and I'll change them whenever I draw plans. And I plan on upgrading my joiner at some point in the next year. Check out Wahuda Tools. They make excellent benchtop joiners. They have cast iron surfaces. They have 4-sided indexable carbide cutters. And they've just got a great line of products that they're importing. And I would encourage you to check that out. But anyhow, there's some flaws in my mount that I knew going into it. Number one, it's mounted on a single set of drawer glides. I just reinforced that by putting this leg in here, which stiffens up the entire mount, and it's stiffer than an old sawhorse mount that I had this on for years. But I would like to add in 2 fold-down legs, 1 on each end, and then just double up the drawer glides. It just gives it that much more stiffness without even having to rely on the legs. So those are 2 changes I would make to the joiner mount. And when it comes time to make the plans, I'll correct that. So currently between the center column of the spindle of the drill press and the column of the bandsaw, I have 13 inches. Had I not cut off that 8 inches, I would have 21 inches of full clearance all around the drill press. That's really a non-issue because you can have long pieces go off to the side of the drill press, or I can remove my bandsaw due to the French cleat mount. But once again, it's just an artificial constraint that I shouldn't have to work around because I made that judgment call earlier, and I'm kicking myself for it now. I love the location of the bandsaw and the outfeed. It would be even better if I had, that 8 inches of support here and could move it over. You can also see down here that all of my space underneath the bench is now basically allocated. But you can just imagine how much better the storage capacity would be if I had that extra 8 inches down below for just additional space, whether it's for cords or dust collection piping, etc. underneath. That 8 inches would go a long way in freeing up a lot of space or just giving me flexibility down below. I'd like to put a router table, router lift in here at some point. Currently I just use my benchtop router table, but I would like to put a dedicated lift in here. All right, so next we're going to get up and personal with the dust collection. But I have an awful lot of 90s in this dust collection system. Originally I had planned to have my dust collector actually mounted, or at least the outfeed of my pipe mounted on the far end of the bench, so that everything coming from machines would come in line and go out that one side of the bench. That way it was a straight airstream leaving each machine and going into the separator or the dust collector. Because I cut that 8 inches off, I was constrained on space between the drill press mount and the bandsaw mount, so I couldn't fit that pipe section there, and I ended up just coming off the end and pulling from the bandsaw instead. So that would be something I would change. And the other part is just all the 90s are not good practice when it comes to airflow, especially using a shop vac as a dust collector. Yes, I bought my current shop vac at Walmart, and I actually am happy with the performance of it so far, but I'm only like 2 months into it, so I can't give you an honest opinion on it. And of course, you can never trust those horsepower outputs, but I did look at the air watt rating, and if that's an honest number, it was comparable to shop vac brand and some of the others, like Rigid, on some of their heavier duty models. And also what I needed was a small footprint, because you can see I collect all my dust into this bin, and really all this is doing is providing suction. And of course some of the fines get pulled into that too, but really I just wanted the suction motor. Okay, so this next one's probably a no-brainer, but it took me several years before I added my vise here. Now, I still second guess the location of it, but if you look around at all my machines, that would be the other location where I would put it, directly across from the miter saw. I can't figure out a better place to put it, especially considering I want to leave that area open for the router table. But this is where I chose to put it. I wanted the vise and the faces of the vise to be contained on one cart for whenever it separates. You know, I do clamp to the top for work hold a lot. That gets into another one. I would have added dog holes to this thing earlier. More of a Polk style top with, you know, just dog holes every, you know, half vise width or whatever for clamping. I should have added it. It would have made assembly and work holding just that much more efficient and given me some more clamping options when I'm laying out things and assembling. Because now looking at it, I've got to avoid pipe, I've got to avoid wiring, I've got to work around all my machine fixtures. It's just would be a pain in the butt. It would have been too easy to drill those holes before I assembled it, or right after I assembled the cart, before I added anything else to it. So vise and bench dog holes, if you think you're going to want them in the future, add them up front. If I'm doing dog holes across from the vise, I would likely scabble on another sheet of 20 millimeter or 3/4 inch plywood underneath, just to give me a full 1.5 inch thickness in the area of at least my primary bench dog areas. And the reason for that is holdfast would be something that I would like to add into this, but this is primarily a power tool workbench, so maybe not. Okay, so another thing I would change, I would wire the workbench earlier in my process. So I told you I built this over a series of probably a little over a year. I didn't actually wire my workbench until probably 6 months into the process. I also used 10 gauge wiring. So everything wiring wise in this bench, with the exception of the actual receptacles themselves, are capable of carrying 220 volt. It was a pain in the butt. Those short, stubby 10 gauge connections, getting them onto small 120 volt receptacles, it was just a bear, especially under the bench, inside of a tight work box. Just not good technique. So I would have used 12 gauge wiring. It would have saved me some money. It would have been easier to wire. And I had to use box extensions, so that actually lessened some of my clearance for running dust collection pipe, etc. So anyhow, I would use 10 gauge, I would use 12 gauge wiring, and I would have done the wiring a lot sooner. I had to work around a lot of things to do the wiring. It was a pain in the butt. So the 10 gauge wiring was so that I wouldn't have any resistance. There's resistance in the bench, but so I would have minimal resistance inside the actual bench. When I run like the table saw on startup or through a cut and the shop vac, I am getting close to maxing out 15 amps of current draw through my bench. So between this and having a long extension cord on it, I didn't want really any added resistance in the wiring in the bench. So that's why I went with 10 gauge. 12 gauge probably would have been about the same, and it would have been a lot easier to wire. But anyhow, that was my logic whenever I did the 10 gauge, but it wasn't necessary. And just a note on the wiring too. So I draw all of my power off of one 20 amp receptacle as it stands right now, because I really only ever run two machines or two tools at the same time, some kind of dust collection and the table saw. And then when I've had people over, you might add a sander to that or a drill press or, you know, another machine for a brief period of time. So I really don't draw a lot of current at one time in my shop because it's really a single person workspace. So I can get by on a 120, on a 110 volt 20 amp circuit for my whole space. It's really difficult to get a good camera angle, but you can see I've got my 10 gauge power coming in here. I go into two receptacle boxes, so I have effectively 8 receptacles right there. I've got one for benchtop tools right here. I go into another bank of 8 receptacles there, and then on the far side another receptacle, and then I did use lower gauge wire coming out to these. So you can see how many things I have plugged in at one time, but only about 2 of them are ever energized at one time. Okay, so there's 2 things I would change about my table saw station. Number 1, you can see when I initially added it, I built the platform right under the saw, and I just had a very small storage area here. I came back over time and scabbed this on. If I were to do it over again, I would just use one wide sheet and make a nice wide platform for the table saw, and probably build a drawer or some kind of a box here to store my table saw accessories. Things just fall off of this all the time from vibrations or from moving the cart around. It's not good for blades, it's not good for the things that are here, and it's just not a good storage area. I did round it a little bit because I'm of course walking around the bench pretty frequently and I didn't want to catch myself on a sharp corner, but I would just completely redesign this table saw station. I haven't drawn plans for it yet. That's part of the reason why, is I haven't thought through exactly what I would do if I do this again, but I would just approach the table saw stand a little bit differently. It is cantilevered out from the workbench. Well, not technically cantilevered. I have supports that go down at an angle to tie it into the bench, but I would of course make those joints as stiff as possible because it's not infrequent for a table saw to support at least 50 pounds of material, all the way up to close to 100 with some of the heavier sheets of melamine and MDF, etc. So this section has to be extremely strong. Another thing I did is I actually enclosed underneath this table saw. So this job site saw is pretty notorious, along with most of them, for dumping dust straight down below. I decided to close in the dust just under the saw, and I figured I would add a dust chute in the future. I have not done that 5 years later, 5-6 years later, and it's still on the to-do list. I would probably do that again, but I would add that dust chute earlier, because a routine chore I have to do is just cleaning out the dust that catches inside the cabinet, but at least it's not dumping on the floor. So on workbench height, I would probably keep the same workbench height, which I did in my plans. I am 71 inches tall, that's 180 centimeters tall. The workbench height right now is 38 3/4 inches tall. That's also 958 millimeters tall. That's a higher work surface, but it's better for your back long term. Power tool woodworking, I like to be in the kind of like lower chest, upper belly area. You just have more leverage and control over a power tool. So I think it's an appropriate woodworking height for that. Also, the height under the bench from shelf to the bottom of this board here is 29 3/4 inches, or right about 50 centimeters. So that's plenty of height to work with for both the dust collection bin and any of my other fixtures that I have mounted down below. So I think that the bench height in total is a good trade-off for both work height as a assembly table and for the storage needs that I have underneath it. Okay, the next thing I get asked about pretty frequently, or I see a lot of people talk about when it comes to workbenches, is locking versus non-locking casters. I apologize, this is a horrible angle to get, but I believe I have, well, I know the diameter is 5 inches, but I think they're hard rubber non-locking casters, and I have 8 of them, 4 for each cart, because these separate into 2 carts right here. So each one has 4 casters under it. They're 5-inch, and they have held up very well over the years in different conditions. So I have had no caster failures, and this cart has so much inertia that even when I'm pushing a sheet of plywood through it, it just doesn't really move around. But the trade-off of having locking casters, number one, cost, and number two, locking casters I've found will cut into
the sidewall of the caster and cause an early failure.
It depends on the casters you buy, but to get quality locking casters that actually do their job, support the weight, and then that you can access whenever they're in under the bench like that, are just difficult to find. I needed casters under all 4 corners of both carts, so some of those casters are in under there several inches, and they're hard to get to. So just locking them would be impossible. So that's something to consider if you're building a setup like this. But I went with non-locking, and I'm not regretting it. When I use it on my driveway that has a little bit of a slope, I just put a board under one end of it as a chalk, and it keeps it from rolling.
Okay, so those are the primary things I would change after using my setup for the past 5.5 years. Lots of little things I would tweak that I've corrected in the plans or added to in the plans after drawing them. I'd love to hear your feedback or any questions you might have. Go ahead and put them down in the comments below, and I'll get to as many of them as I can. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.